Okay, let's go to Scripture. Let's open up. Thank you, Scott. Let's go to Philippians chapter 1. Philippians chapter 1, starting in verse 27. You follow along as I read aloud. Philippians 1:27. Only let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of your affairs, that you stand fast in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel, and not in any way terrified by your adversaries, which is to them a proof of perdition, or judgment, but to you of salvation, and that from God. For to you it has been granted, on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake, having the same conflict which you saw in me, and now here is in me. Let's bow before the Lord this evening. Heavenly Father, you are great, awesome, and mighty. Thank you for giving us your word that leads us into godliness, that is for our good, to correct us. Lord, as we study your faithfulness throughout church history and we look at Adoniram Judson, I pray that we would be blessed and that we would grow in godliness together. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. Adoniram Judson was not the first missionary to Burma. As I was doing some studying, many people thought that he was the first missionary to Burma, but that was not the case. Let's look at him. Here he is, strapping man. As I was doing some studying, turns out this picture gives him much grace. He was not this good-looking in real life. Adoniram Judson was not the first missionary to Burma. He was, however, America's first foreign missionary. The first man to travel from this country to another to share the gospel. So here he is. Let's look at his life and his faith this evening. He was born in Malden, Massachusetts. Eventually. There we go. He was born in Malden, Massachusetts on August 9th, 1788. His father was a Congregationalist pastor, and his father liked to run a very tight ship. He was very organized. His father made sure that after every meal, the family gathered together for a time of worship and of reading the Bible. And this helped Adoniram learn to read. And as maybe a quick side note here, I listened to some audiobooks on Adoniram Judson, and the narrator pronounced his name as Adoniram Judson. So if I am pronouncing his name wrong, please show me some grace. I'm going to stick with Adoniram. So as his family would go through and they would do Bible readings together, Adoniram picked up very quickly on how to read. One day his father left on a preaching episode at another church, another city, and his mother would pull out the Bible and she would teach him to read at the tender age of 3. Now, let's see, I know 3, that might be a little young for most of you to remember, but just maybe by show of hands, did anyone learn how to read by the age of 3? No? Okay, so even at an early age, Adoniram was exceptionally brilliant. So brilliant, in fact, that he excelled even in his public school. His father found that he was so smart and excelled so quickly in school. He passed all of his classmates, was able to accomplish grades before the rest of the children of his age, And so his father decided to put him also in navigation school. Does anyone know, by show of hands, what navigation school is? No. Pastor Jamie does, but that's okay. Navigation school is when you would learn how to, much like driving a car, like driver's training, but for boats. His father put him into school to learn how to navigate a boat. That's how smart he was. I certainly can't do anything like that. He loved to do puzzles. He was very smart. One day, at a young age, it said, as I was doing some reading, that Adoniram took his father's copy of the newspaper. Oh, you don't take Dad's copy of the newspaper. And he snuck off with the newspaper, and he looked in and he tried to find the Weekly Enigma. That was the local newspaper's puzzle for the week. And he studied and he learned and he thought his way through the puzzle. He cut out the puzzle, mailed it to the newspaper publisher to see if he got the answer right. And his father did catch wind of that, and it didn't go over so well. His father was very strict, but at least he tried, so he's very smart. He had a few siblings. He had 2 sisters, Abigail and Mary. He had one brother named Elnathan. So those of you who are considering names for your children, I would recommend Elnathan. I like that name, but maybe not for my kids. Yours, though, that's fine. But his youngest sister, Mary, died at an early age. She was only 6 months old when she died. And this troubled Adoniram deeply. He had a hard time with this. And she died when he was 8 years old. And even at that age, after listening to his father's preaching and his sister dying, and he had a hard time reconciling that. He said, how can there be a God that would let my sister die? He had a hard time with that. And it really, even at an early age, the age of 8, put him at odds with Christianity. He had a hard time with that. Like I said, he was very smart. So at the age of 16, he made his way to Brown University. And I'm 21, and I have not yet got my acceptance letter to Brown. I don't know what the holdup is. I'm sure it's coming, though. But at the age of 16, Adoniram goes to Brown, not just to Brown University, but he entered as a sophomore. So he's 16 in a class with students much older than he. And as if that wasn't enough, after 3 years at Brown, he achieves valedictorian status. So clearly, he was absolutely brilliant, exceptionally smart. He loved logic. He loved to study things. He loved to read. As we can see, that some of his entrance exams included math. I'd be in trouble. Logic. I'm not getting much better. Philosophy. Well, I slept through one of those classes. I think grammar. Well, don't see anything I read. Greek, I'm working on the Greek. Latin, not so much. And astronomy, that stuff is beyond me. So he's just absolutely brilliant. But it wasn't always for his good. The Lord has to turn him around and use his intellect for God's glory. He didn't start off that way. Because while at Brown, he met a young man, a dear friend of his named Jacob Eames. The two became very good friends. They enjoyed each other's company. And Jacob Eames, one thing about him that was a little bit different, that Jacob Eames was a deist. Does anyone know what deism is? I know it's on the screen, but who's heard of deism by any chance? Oh, a few people. Deism says that there is a God somewhere, there is a God, and he created everything, but then that God, he walked away from creation. God has nothing to do with the world today. He might have created it, sure, but as far as every day-to-day life, God has nothing to do with it. And so Adoniram, being smart, being logical, being in university, having a friend who is all about deism, that stuck. And Adoniram quickly ascribed to deism. After he graduated, he took some time to go home. And he went home for a little bit, and he said, well, now that I graduated, and what am I going to do with my life? He said, well, maybe I'll be a teacher. I wouldn't mind doing that. So he opens up a school in Plymouth, and he runs his school for about a year or so. He says, I really don't want to do this anymore. I'm sick of teaching. It's not for me. In fact, he wrote the textbooks for his own school and got them published with a little support from the president of Brown University, just the president of Brown. But so he ran a school, and he said, I don't really like that anymore. So I'm going to see what my parents think. His dad says, well, son, I have an idea for you. Are you man enough to step into your father's shoes? I hope my dad never says that to me. That would probably make me I'd probably be a little angry. And kind of like Adoniram, he was as well. His dad said, are you man enough to step into your father's shoes? How about you be a pastor? Oh, Adoniram wanted nothing to do with that. He says, are you kidding me? I'm a deist. I don't want anything to do with your Christian God. You know what? I'm leaving. I'm out of here. Give me some of my inheritance. He takes part of his inheritance, which consisted of one horse and a saddle. And that was it. That was his inheritance. And he says, okay, I want nothing to do with your Christianity. I want nothing to do with you. I'm leaving. He goes to New York. And of all things, with the college education, I think I'm going to go be a part of the theater. I'm going to go, I'm going to write plays. That's what I'm going to do. He said, oh, me and Jacob, and we would talk about the grandiose things of life. He said, maybe I'll be president one day. Maybe I'll be a senator. Oh, well, let's try my hand at playwriting. Well, he goes ahead and he tries. Just so happened that during this time, 1808, 1809, that the New York theater was having its worst financial season to date. We see the hand of Providence slowly working in Adoniram's life. So he couldn't get a job. Nobody wanted to hire a playwright that had no prior experience. They didn't care about his degree. He said, we didn't want nothing to do with you. So after shuffling around New York for some time, he said, okay, I need to do something. I'm hungry. So he joins up with a merry troupe of actors. And, well, maybe I can squeak by with these actors. Except they weren't actors. They were con artists. And what they would do is they would sneak around from local inn to local tavern, and they would get food, they would stay the night, and then they would leave before the next morning came and they had to pay the bill. This went on for about a month. And finally, Adoniram said, I'm sick of this. I really don't want. What was I thinking? He said, I'm going to go home. He said he was tired of sleeping with rats. He was tired of sleeping with fleas. And he was tired of eating oatmeal. So he said, maybe I'll go back home. On the way home, however, providence happens. God works. And after this time of, going to university, renouncing his faith, living in New York, and all manner of sinfulness, the Lord says, no, I want you. I want you for my own. And what happens here changes Adoniram's perspective on life. He goes to an inn. He was riding on horseback from New York to Plymouth. He was kind of lost. He wasn't sure where to go. He said, well, maybe I'll cash in for the night. I'm going to go to an inn. He goes up to the innkeeper and he says, Mr. Innkeeper, I'd like a room. I'd like a bed for. Do you have any open room for a weary traveler? He says. And the innkeeper, he scratches his beard. Well, I don't know if he had a beard, but I'd imagine he's an innkeeper, so he has to have a beard. So he scratches his beard and he says, well, no, actually, I don't have any room for you. He says, oh, please, sir, just anywhere, just a mat by the fire. That's all I want. Just somewhere to sleep for the night. And the innkeeper, he thinks for a minute, he scratches his beard some more, and he says, I do have a room for you. One condition. The room is also being used by a man who is sick and dying. But don't worry, I put up a linen sheet to separate the room in half, so, don't worry about the germs. He says, Adoniram says, I'll take it. I'm so tired from the horseback riding, I'll go right to sleep. So he says, sure, I'll sleep with the room with a sick and dying man. So he goes into the room. And I don't know if it was something about the noises that this sick man was making, the coughing and the moaning and the groaning and the wheezing and the sounds that a sick person makes. And Adoniram is trying to sleep, and he can't sleep. It's too noisy. So he thinks for a moment, well, I wonder who this man is. I wonder, did this man get to do everything he wanted to do in life? Does this man know about eternity? What does this man think about his soul? Where will his soul go when he dies? And those questions slowly begin to turn on himself. Will I get to do everything I want to do in life? Do I know what's going to happen to me when I die? He says, well, I don't know, but I don't want to think about it. He goes to sleep. The next morning, he comes out. He wants some breakfast. And he says, innkeeper, is there still time for breakfast? He says, sure. Pulls out a bowl of oatmeal. And Adoniram asks the innkeeper, so whatever happened to that man? Is he okay? He didn't notice him there this morning. The innkeeper says, oh no, he died in his sleep last night. And Adoniram says, well, do you know who he was? The innkeeper thinks for a minute. He probably rummages through some papers, and he looks and he says, I think he was somebody from Brown University. Yeah, that's right. I think his name was Jacob Eames, was the man. So now all of those questions that Adoniram was thinking last night had answers. He knew what Jacob Eames believed. He knew that he was not ready to face his Creator, and it shook him to his core. He said, there's no way that this happened by pure coincidence. My deism has no way to answer this. It must not be true. This doesn't work. And so now he says, okay, I need to figure out what the truth is. He goes to Andover Theological Seminary. Shortly after his admission to Andover Seminary, he gets saved. And after he gets saved, he begins a process of discerning, what will the Lord do with me? What will the Lord use with my life? And he thinks about, maybe I'll be a missionary. He read about William Carey. He read about these other missionaries. And he thinks for a minute, I think I want to go and be a missionary to the Far East. So he finds some like-minded individuals at Andover, and they form a group called the Brethren. The Brethren, they were a group of men, and they decided that we will commit ourselves to missionary work. We decided we're going to be missionaries, and you in this group, let's hold one another accountable while we strive to be missionaries. That was June 1810. The men, whose names follow, Samuel Knott, Samuel Newell, Samuel Mills, and Adoniram Judson, I imagine their meetings must have been kind of difficult to coordinate. Hey, Sam, what do you think? What? Three Sams. In any case, they dedicate themselves to mission work. I'll save the jokes for another time. And so they said, okay, we're going to be missionaries. And they say, well, we need some money to be missionaries. And so some of the professors at Andover Seminary, they say, okay, you guys, you got to go start petitioning churches. Start asking for money. Try and raise support. So these men, they go before the General Assembly of Congregationalist Ministers. And they come before them, and in about 20 minutes, they stand up before these group of men, these ministers. And they say, okay, guys, we were wondering if you would support us as we desire to go be missionaries somewhere in East Asia. And they say, well, that sounds good, but we got to think about it. They say, there's no hope for us. There was no interest in missionary work at this time amongst the churches in America. There was no desire. No one cared. There was no real push or interest for mission work. They said, well, there's no way, no hope for us. But the Lord provided, and sure enough, they were approved for support And the General Assembly of Congregationalist Ministers begins to work and plan and process how are we going to send these guys to the mission field. It was during this time, also, as they were planning and preparing, that Adoniram meets a young woman named Anne Hazelton. Anne Hazelton was the youngest daughter of a deacon who was on this General Assembly of Congregationalist Ministers, and so Adoniram met her dad, and sure enough, was introduced to Anne, and he wrote her a letter, and he said, well, Anne, would you consider being acquainted to me? I had to look that one up. Being acquainted, that's what they used to say would be like courting. Sorry, they're young people. They didn't date back then. I hate to burst your bubble. That's a different conversation, though. So he says, Anne, will you consider acquainting me? Courting me. I'm going to just say courting me. That sounds really weird to say acquainting. Anne, would you court me? And she says, I don't know there, Adoniram. I got to ask my parents. Good answer. And so Adoniram writes a letter to Anne's father. This is what he wrote. I have now to ask whether you can consent to part with your daughter early next spring. It gets better. To see her no more in this world. Scotty, help me out here. Whether you can consent to her departure and her subjection to the hardships and sufferings of a missionary life. Whether you can consent to her exposure to the dangers of the ocean, to the fatal influence of the southern climate of India, to every kind of want and distress, to degradation, insult, persecution, perhaps a violent death. Can you consent to all of this? Listen here. It sounds so bleak and so terrible, doesn't it? But listen to this is what he says. Can you consent to all of that for the sake of him who left his heavenly home and died for her and for you, for the sake of perishing immortal souls, for the sake of Zion and the glory of God? Can you consent to all this in the hope of soon meeting your daughter in the world of glory with a crown of righteousness, brightened with the acclamations of praise, which shall redound to her Savior from the heathen saved through her means from eternal woe and despair? That's what he wrote to her father. I don't know if I would ever write that to a young woman I was considering to court, let alone her father. But you can see, I think, Adoniram's mind and his heart for missions, and his aim and desire to make much of Christ among those who do not know his name. And so her father and mother too, they thought about it and they said, well, we can't say no, because everything he said is, well, yeah, it makes sense. They said, well, it's up to Anne. And sure enough, Anne says, I would love to court you, is what she says. It was July. Get acquainted, yes. I would love to be acquainted with you. So that was July 1810. And shortly after, things get moving here. By September 1811, this board set forth by this General Assembly called the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. That was the name of his board to send them and support them as missionaries. By September 1811, they say, okay, it's official. We're going to send you somewhere. How are you going to pay for it? We don't know, but we're sending you. It's official. And they say, great. Once they get the news of that, Adoniram and Anne, they begin talking of marriage. And look here at the dates. They're married February 5th. And Adoniram, Anne, and these other missionaries, they set sail for Calcutta, India, February 19th. There was no time wasted. And for those of you that like long car rides, I see most of you get very excited on those long car rides. I think the longest trip I've ever done was the flight to Germany, 9 hours. as far as travel goes. It took them, count with me, February, March, April, May, you're counting so well, June. February, March, April, May, June. February, March, April, May, June. Thank you. 5 months on a ship from Boston to Calcutta, India. There was much time to think and process, and Adoniram spent time studying the scriptures, and we'll see how that influenced him in a minute. But 5 months they were on a boat. This is a picture of Anne. Well, I should say it's an artist rendering of Anne. Technically, this was while they were in Burma, but it's an artist rendering anyway, so she probably didn't look anything like that. But that's her. So, the 5 months they're on a boat. They arrive now in Calcutta, India. Has anyone seen the Pirates of the Caribbean movies? I'm curious. A few hands in the front and some in the back. Okay, does anyone remember the East India Trade Company? Okay, that wasn't just in the movies, that was a real thing. There was a company, a joint stock company set forth in India and the East there to basically run a monopoly on all their natural resources. The East India Company, when these missionaries checked in Calcutta, India, they had to go to the police station. They had to register their presence. We're here. The East India Company, they wanted nothing to do with that. And immediately, the East India Company and all their agents and all their affiliates began pressuring these missionaries to leave. So can you imagine this? You're on a boat ride for 5 months. You've taken everything you basically own. You said goodbye to everyone you know in America, and you're on a boat, 5 months. You get to India. You don't speak the language. You have an Indian person or maybe a British person speaking to you saying, you can't be here. Why in the world would you come to India without permission from the East India Company? Oh, no, you can't be here. You got to go now. And so immediately, pressure was to get them to leave. It was like a game of cat and mouse that they began to play with the East India Company. They go back and forth from Calcutta, India, to the Isles of France, to Madras, to back and forth, trying to stay one step ahead of the East India Company. And during this time, on one of their boat rides, avoiding the company, Anne had given birth to her first child, but a storm came in and caught the ship and the crew off guard, and everything became soaked and drenched in the storm, and the little baby died just a few days after being born. And this shook them, Adoniram and Anne, to their core. They had a hard time with this. They questioned, God, how in the world could you let this happen? We left everything to go to India to be your missionaries. What was all this? And they were just broken-hearted. So eventually, they make their way to Burma. This was after their child dying. Anne became very sick. Something about the storm and the seasickness. I've never been on a boat, except for a few times here in Michigan, and the seasickness caused Anne to become very ill. And so during all of this, as Adoniram was studying, remember his father was a Congregationalist. And their view on baptism was a sprinkling, not what you and I, what we observe here at church as far as full immersion. So as Adoniram is looking at the Greek and he's wondering, well, when I start making converts, the Lord starts producing converts here in Burma, what am I going to do? Am I going to sprinkle them, or am I going to fully immerse them? And so he looks at the Greek and he changes his view. Also in part of William Carey, whom he met while in India. And William Carey actually tried to convince Adoniram not to go to Burma. He tried to say, Adoniram, you need to go home. Go be a missionary to the Native Americans. Don't be a missionary here. Don't even try going to Burma. But nonetheless, Adoniram changes his view. A new missionary board is created. Finally, they find a ship to take them to Rangoon, India. And that was June 22nd, 1813. Keep the year in mind. Keep the year 1813 in mind. This will come up a little bit later. Immediately upon their arrival to Burma, they begin learning the language. And in the studies, they said they had a hard time with this because there's really no grammar. There's no, the way it was written is just a bunch of swirls and circles, and you need to have a really good teacher. It's almost imperceivable what the meaning is. It took them, they said that they studied for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week to learn the language. That was basically what they devoted themselves to, essentially their first year or so of being in Burma. By September 1815, Adoniram and Ann had their second child. And again, regrettably, their second child also passed away. Was only 7 months old. We read that scripture in Philippians about suffering also for Christ, even as they've barely begun their mission work, and they're right there in Philippians 1. So after they learned the language, Adoniram began working on a grammar book. We talked about William Carey when we started this series of Heroes of the Faith. Pastor Brian taught us about William Carey. William Carey had a son named Felix. Felix actually was in Burma. That's why I said Adoniram was not the first missionary. Felix Carey was the first missionary to Burma. And Felix started working on a grammar book to help understand the Burmese language a little bit. But Felix had to leave. There was some other things. We're not talking about Felix, we're talking about Adoniram. So Adoniram finished Felix's work on the grammar for the Burman language. That was 1816. They've been there 3 years already, and they're just now getting a grasp on the language. Also at this time, 1816, some other missionaries came. George and Phoebe Hoff. They came. They were sent from the mission board, and they brought with them a printing press. This printing press was vital for Adoniram's mission work in Burma. It allowed them to produce gospel tracts. So Adoniram and Ann, they would work together and think about, okay, how do we communicate the gospel to the Burman people? And I suppose before we get too ahead of ourselves, I'm going to break protocol here. We're going to go slides out of order. Because we need to understand, we need to grasp how important it was for him to make these tracts. This picture behind me is called the Shui Dagon Pagoda. It is a temple for the Buddhists. It is a shrine where the Buddhist people, the worshippers of Buddha, come. Some of the Buddha's hairs are enshrined at this temple. And so all the people who practice Buddhism in Burma, they would come once a year to this giant building. That is gold, by the way. The whole building is covered in gold. They are enshrining the Buddha, his legacy, his teaching, here at this building, Shui Dagon Pagoda. That's in Rangoon, right where Adoniram and Ann are. So the culture is one that is fully immersed in Buddhism. Buddhism does not believe in an eternal God. They just believe that there's the Noble Eightfold Path. If you do some good stuff, then you'll have good things happen to you. And eventually, if you do enough good stuff, you'll just kind of break the cycle of life and you'll go into nothingness. That's the picture of Buddhism. This is what Adoniram and Ann were trying to bring the gospel into. And the problem is that all of Burma was Buddhist. It was declared by the king. It was, you had to be Buddhist. There's no other religion that you could be. So for Adoniram to bring another religion, no one wanted to be converted. They said, I would rather be Buddhist with my family, even if it's not true, than be a Christian and not have my family. So this is why the printing press and the tracts were so important. What year did Adoniram and Ann arrive in Rangoon, Burma? It's in your notes, I think. 1813, excellent. Look at the year, 1819. What happens in 1819? I'm glad you asked. In 1819, finally, Adoniram and Ann, they were good enough with the language that they started holding Sunday church services fully in the Burmese language. This is huge. But it took them 6 years. 6 years of just labor before they can hold church services in the Burmese language. Also, during this time, they started making a zayat, which is that picture down on the bottom of the screen. It's like if you wanted to picture the tent that we have, or maybe the booth for the good old days is like a tent that people come and they can visit and talk with us. That's kind of like what a zayat is. It's an open building. There's no walls, just a roof. And people would come to the various zayats and they would learn various teachings. And so Adoniram would stand out in the zayat and he would shout on the street, "Anyone who thirsteth after knowledge, come, I will tell you about the eternal God." Day in and day out, he's publicly preaching and evangelizing, trying to get people to come and hear about Christianity. We see finally in June 1819, the Lord gave a convert to Adoniram's and Anne's efforts. His name was Mung Nao. He was the first convert to be made and was baptized on June 27th, 1819. There's our Shui Dagon Pagoda again. We already talked about that. By 1820, a little roundabouts a year, they have 10 converts. And what would happen is, as Adoniram would make a convert, this convert would come and live with the missionaries and say, let us teach you about Jesus. Let us share with you the truth of God. And they would train them up and they would disciple these men as they were converted so that they could go out and make disciples. So in about a year, they now have 10 converts. 2 years after that, they get 18. And during this time, as Adoniram is trying to evangelize, he's also working on translating the New Testament from Burmese, or from the original languages of Greek into Burmese. He could have used English, but he said, no, I want to make a faithful, accurate translation. So he went from the Greek into Burmese. And by July 1823, he gets the whole New Testament translated. One problem, couldn't print it. He was not able to print it because of, if we know our history, a war broke out around this time. There was some tension in 1823, but by 1824, Burma and Great Britain go to war. And this was, I believe, called the First Burman War. There would end up being 2 others, but in 1824 we have the First Burman War. And because of this war, the king, his name was King Bagyadah, he said, if we cannot trust the British, then we cannot trust any foreigners. And in 1824, June 1824, all foreigners in Burma were arrested because they were foreigners, which meant they were spies working for Great Britain. Even though Adoniram was American, it didn't matter. So that's why he was unable to print his translation of the New Testament. He was in prison. He was in prison for a little over a year. For those of you that have young children, he was in prison for 17 months. That means nothing to me. A little over a year. Nothing? Okay. During this time, Anne took care of him. Scott laughed, so that's okay. That's all that matters. This is a picture, I should say, artist rendering of what it was like to be in prison, in a Burmese prison. So here's what would happen. These men called spotted faces would come. And the spotted faces were called spotted faces because they had spots on their face. Okay, we are awake. We're alive and well. The Spirit is within us. Okay, they had spots on their face. What were the spots? What do the spots mean? The spots signified that you had committed a crime, but instead of putting you to death like you deserved, you got put into the Burmese Secret Service, or maybe the Burmese KGB. And you, as a spotted face, ran the prison system. There was no judiciary system. Whatever the king said happened, and the spotted faces were the enforcers. So one day, Adoniram and they're trying to eat dinner, and knock, knock, knock on the door, and they said, "We have come for the teacher." And Adoniram, he opens the door, said, "That's me." He says, "You're under arrest." And immediately he was bound, dragged off into prison. I don't think you want to be in any prison, but especially you don't want to be in a Burmese prison. They were not allowed to go outside. They were put in a cave, and they were stuck there. They could not go outside. They could not see sunlight. There's no fresh air, no food, no water, nowhere to sleep, unless you count the rats. You could sleep with the rats if you did so choose. Don't mind the fleas. Don't mind all the sickness. Adoniram was frequently ill, caught every kind of disease while in prison. Tuberculosis, cholera, fever, you name it. But to make it worse, every night they would put fetters on your feet. These iron chains and latches, they would go around your ankles, and they were riveted together. And you were stuck like that. You couldn't walk. And they would take rope and chain around your fetters, and they would put that on a bamboo pole, and they would hoist the pole up to the ceiling. You had to sleep upside down like a bat every night. He was in there for 17 months. Here's a picture. Anne, during this time, Anne was not arrested. Only Adoniram. That was just simply by the grace of God. So Anne would bring food to Adoniram because there was no food. She would bring water to him. She would try to encourage him as best as she could. She tried to petition him and his release. And during this time, while Adoniram was in prison, she gave birth to her third child. So imagine you're essentially living in prison with your husband, and you give birth and put her in a frail state as far as physical health goes. So after 17 months in prison, by November 1825, he was released. Why was he released? That's a good question. Burma had to surrender to Great Britain. They were unable to fight. Their military was nothing compared to that of Great Britain. And so they came out to these foreign prisoners. They said, okay, we'll let you out on one condition. You help interpret for us. So Adoniram was forced to serve as an interpreter between the Burmese and the British in order for him to get released. This was in the capital city of Burma. Ava was the name of the city. And Anne remained in Rangoon. You had to travel up the Burmese river upstream to get to Ava, and it was difficult for them to travel. Anne could not go with him because there were pirates on the Burmese river. No comment on the pirates. So, okay, we're doing okay. By November 1826, Adoniram stopped his interpreting work. In fact, he even tried to get out earlier, but the East India Company, they said, no, we need you. We need you, Adoniram. Isn't that so convenient? Before, the East India Company was trying to get him to leave. Now, all of a sudden, they said, oh, please, Adoniram, please translate for us. They said, if you do, we'll try and get religious liberty in the Burmese kingdom. He said, okay, I'll do it. Never happened. And he regretted that decision because during his time in the capital city, his wife and third child died. And the worst part of it was he did not even receive news of their death until a month after it had happened because of communication and correspondence. Was not able to hear of the news. And this put him in severe depression. He did not want to do his mission work. He didn't want to do anything. It said that his converts recounted this time when he was terribly depressed. And it says that he went out into the deep jungle, the jungle where nobody goes. You're not supposed to go in the jungle. And he made a little hut, and he said he just sat in the hut. He said he wanted to be alone with his God and with the memories of his dead wife. And the converts that he had made, the disciples he was making, were so afraid for his life because of the tigers that roamed around in the jungle. And they on several occasions, thought that he had died. But the Lord preserved him despite the hardships that he endured. By November 1829, he decides to go back into mission work and thinks, okay, it's a good time to probably revise my New Testament, my translation of the New Testament. And he says, I'm not going to just do the New Testament. I want to do the whole Bible. I want to translate the entire Bible into Burmese. This became his main goal. And so from 1829 to 1834, he strives to translate the entire Bible into Burmese. And he does accomplish that. By January 1824, the whole Bible was translated. But it took some time to print because of the printing press. It took give or take a year to actually print the whole Bible with the printing press. It was after he finished his work translating the Bible that he comes in contact with a fellow missionary. Once again, her name was Sarah Boardman, and her husband had died on the mission field as well in another village in Burma. So he had lost his wife, she had lost her husband. They were both missionaries, and they said, well, what do you say we get married? And she says, sure, I would love that. So April 1834, Adoniram marries Sarah Boardman. She was an encouragement to him as they were serving in the mission field. As we see, by 1835, they had 100 converts. And this was not just from Adoniram, but from the disciples who made disciples who made disciples. Whenever a convert was made, they felt so burdened we need to learn about this Jesus, this eternal God and His Son. And they had such a desire, okay, now that we know, we need to go tell others. I want to go tell my family. I want to go tell my neighbor. There was just part of conversion came with, we need to share the gospel. And the Lord brought great increase through simply sharing the gospel. By 1845, I know that's a 10-year gap. You need to go back and study this on your own. This is simply a cursory study on Adoniram Judson's life. So fast forward now 10 years, 1845, Sarah Boardman gets terribly sick, desperately ill, and the doctors, their number one recommended form of treatment for any sickness was go take a boat ride. That'll clear you up. Go sail around on the Bay of Bengal for a few months. They said, maybe she's kind of sick, so you should go back to America. Adoniram didn't want to. And in fact, 2 years before then, Sarah was sick, and he sent her to go back to, she went to Calcutta instead of America just to try and recover a little bit. But now by this point she was so sick, and Adoniram saw that she was too ill to travel alone. He says, okay, I will go with you. Also, during this 10-year time, between 1835 and 1845, yes, they were doing mission work, but they were also growing their family. Adoniram and Sarah had many children together. 6, if memory serves. 6 between Adoniram and Sarah. Sarah had a few others. You go and study that on your own. So in 1845, Adoniram says, okay, we need to go back to America, and I want to take my oldest children with me because they have the best chance of making it. Because he was so grieved with his 3 children dying from Anne. He grieved. He said, will not my mother see any children live past the age of 2? He said, okay, I'm going to take my older kids. We're going to go to America. I know they'll make it in America. So they go July 1845. After being on the mission field for 33 years, no furlough, 33 years, he says, okay, it's time to go home. He takes Sarah and his 3 oldest kids. They set sail for Boston. On the way, on their sailings from Calcutta to Boston, Sarah did die. She died at sea. And we talk about suffering for Christ, and Adoniram certainly knew what that was like. And he feared going back to America. He said he wasn't even sure if he could have a long conversation in English. His children did not speak any English. They spoke only Burmese. At the home between Adoniram and Sarah, they could not speak any English. He couldn't speak hardly any English. So he really had a hard time going back to America. And his 3 younger ones stayed in Burma. After that, he got his older children resettled. He's preparing to go home. All these churches that supported him, they wanted him to speak. Oh, come speak at our church, speak at our church. He had a lung illness, prevented him from speaking. He could only talk at a whisper volume level. So he had a man, he would speak, and another man would preach for him. And during this time, he actually meets a young woman who is half his age, named Emily Chubbuck. And he asked her to write Sarah Boardman's biography. And as they were sharing stories about Sarah, they fell in love and they got married. The rest is history, I suppose. They go back to Burma, Adoniram and Emily. During this time, Adoniram, he's thinking now, okay, what are we going to do about those who will come after me? Who will come after me, and how can I equip them? So he writes his own English to Burmese dictionary so that those missionaries that come after him will have an easier time learning the language. He went back to Burma in 1846, and 3 years later he finishes his dictionary. Shortly after that, April 12th, 1850, Adoniram died. And if you see, he died sailing on the Bay of Bengal. And the reason why he died at sea was because the doctors, they recommended the best form of treatment was to take a boat ride. And Adoniram, he'd been so sick, so ill for such a long time, he says, okay, I'm not feeling so good. And the doctor said, go take a boat ride. He said, I'm terribly sick. Emily could tell he was sick. His converts, he said, please don't go. And Adoniram said, how can I not do all within my power to recover so that I may continue in the work? So he said, even though I'm deathly ill, I would rather take a boat ride if maybe that would give me a little extra life so I can continue in the work of the missionary. And so he died at sea, and he served in Burma for 37 years. And to this day, Burma is now called Myanmar. Probably butchered that. For those young people that have never heard of Burma, it's because it's called Myanmar right now. And his Bible that he translated is the only Bible in the Burmese language. It's the only Bible they have access to is the one he translated on his own. He was there as a missionary for 37 years. He knew great suffering. He saw great blessing and reward from the Lord. And as his closing quote I chose, devoted for life, Adoniram wrote to one of his mission boards. They had asked him, they had sent some short-term missionaries to Burma on several occasions. They said, Adoniram, how are those short-term missionaries treating you? Adoniram, not being one to mince words, you recall his letter to Anne's father. This is what he said of the short-term missionaries. They are all good for nothing. Not very encouraging. Though brilliant in an English pulpit, they are incompetent to any real missionary work. They come out for a few years with the view of acquiring a stock of credit on which they may vegetate the rest of their days in the congenial climate of their native land. That's encouraging. As to the lessening of trials, the candidate of missions and making the way more smooth before him is just what ought not be done. So he says, these missionaries, they're good for nothing. Yeah, they may be great at home in their native land, but here on the mission field, they're worthless. They want to just come for a little while and have a good time and maybe, earn some credit. Oh, I was in Burma, so see how awesome I am? He says they wanted the way to be smooth before them. And Adoniram says, oh no, just the opposite it should be. This is what he says. Missionaries need more trials on their first setting out instead of less. The motto of every missionary, whether preacher, printer, or schoolmaster, ought to be what? Devoted for life. And I think we see that in this brief, I hope it was brief, survey of Adoniram Judson's life. Pastor Scott is going to come and close our time this evening.